Welcome to the continuation of our read aloud of the split history of westward expansion. We began yesterday reading about westward expansion from the settler's perspective, and we use reading strategies to help us identify main ideas. So far, we have found evidence to support three main ideas. The European settlers moved to enhance or better their lives. The European settlers faced many hardships along the way. And the European settlers were inconsiderate and took land away from the rightful inhabitants. Today, as we move on to Chapter 2, we will continue to search for evidence to support our three main ideas. We will also be looking at how the author presented the information to us. In other words, text structure. So Chapter 2, Settling the West. The U.S. government encouraged people to move west, especially families. The government believed that families would settle land quickly and make it a safe, desirable place to live. With settlers farming the land, establishing towns, and building churches, the West would soon become a prosperous place, and the entire U.S. would benefit. In 1838, the government founded the Corps of Topographical Engineers. The group would survey western lands and decide what land was best for settlements. It would map the region to give settlers a better idea of what the West looked like. The maps would help people plan their trips westward. The government helped people settle the West by selling tracts of land to any settler who could afford it. By the 1830s, the government was selling 40-acre lots of land for $1.25 an acre. At that price, many families could afford to buy land. So I'm going to pause here to think about my reading. And I'm going to think if any of the information that I just read can connect to information I read previously, like yesterday in Chapter 1. And I think it does. In these few chapters, I learned that settlers were going to be buying land that was for themselves. They were able to buy 40 acres of land that they could farm and they could build a home. When they're able to farm on their own land, they're able to grow crops and sell those crops for a profit, which in turn would make their lives better. Also, with more settlers farming the land, more towns are built, churches are built, and the West would soon become a prosperous place, which means a lot more settlers could come and make more money. So I think that evidence can support my main idea of the European settlers moved in order to enhance their lives. I'm also looking at the way the information is presented to me. Now, I know a lot of people would jump right to the description text structure. Oh, because it's describing the West. But I don't know. I don't think so. It didn't give me information on how wide the land tracts were. It didn't give me information about the weather. It didn't give me information about any of the landforms that were out there. So I'm going to hold off on thinking about text structure until I have a few more pieces of information. Wagon trains. Between 1840 and 1870, about 500,000 settlers headed west. Many traveled on the Santa Fe Trail or the Oregon Trail. The 900-mile Santa Fe Trail began in Missouri and ended in New Mexico Territory. The Oregon Trail also started in Missouri and spanned 2,170 miles to the Pacific Northwest. I want to just take a moment and look at this text feature, which is the map. And I'm going to use this map to help me understand the distance of both trails. The Oregon Trail here in green, which is 2,170 miles to Oregon country, looks very long. And it kind of looks like it would be hard because these are the Rocky Mountains. And I'm thinking that you'd have to travel over the Rocky Mountains. Sometimes I can barely make it up the hills in the South Mountain Reservation. So I can only imagine how much harder it would be to travel over the Rocky Mountains. Then, here in red, is the Santa Fe Trail. It looks much smaller than the Oregon Trail. Still have to climb over those Rocky Mountains, though. But I'm also noticing it's in the southwestern part of the United States. And from what I know, my prior knowledge about the southwestern part of the United States, it's dry and dusty. Again, maybe not an easy way to travel. It wasn't easy to move out west. Settlers had to leave friends and family behind, knowing that they might never see them again. Once on the trail, they were forced to rely completely on themselves and their traveling companions. As a result, people who wanted to move west were usually independent and used to hard work. 13-year-old Martha Morrison headed to Oregon with her family in 1844. We did not know the dangers we were going through. The idea of my father was to get to the coast. No other place suited him, and he went right ahead until he got there. People traveled west in covered wagons. Oxen were stronger than horses, so they usually pulled the wagons. The covered wagons were not very big, a little larger than an SUV or minivan, and couldn't hold more than 2,000 pounds. People could only bring the things they needed for survival. Some people tried to take large pieces of furniture with them when they moved. More often than not, those big pieces of furniture ended up on the side of the trail when their owners decided not to haul them any further. The settlers quickly learned that when the trails got rough, the extra weight of anything large made traveling much harder. Some families made the trip alone, but most traveled in groups. Wagon trains usually included 20 to 40 wagons, but some had more than 100. Wagon trains typically traveled between 8 and 20 miles each day. If rainy weather turned the trail to mud, they didn't travel as far. But if the weather was good and everyone in the group was well, they traveled as far as they could. Settlers left Independence, Missouri, called the jumping-off point for the Oregon Trail, in May so they could cross the Rocky Mountains before the winter snows closed the passes. I'm going to pause here to think about my reading. And this is what I learned, that the covered wagons were not very big, they couldn't hold more than 2,000 pounds, so sometimes when they were heavy, the settlers had to throw things away and leave them on the side of the trail. Weather was kind of rough. If it rained too much, the trail became mud and you couldn't travel. Sometimes you had to stop. And time. You had to make it through a certain amount of distance so that you can cross the Rocky Mountains before, again, the winter closed in on you. Those details sound like problems to me. And maybe the author is writing this in a problem and solution text structure to really get me to understand that this Oregon Trail and traveling westward was not as easy as some people thought it would be. The Donner Party. Perhaps the most tragic story of the Oregon Trail is that of the Donner Party. The Donner Party was made up of about 200 men, women, and children who left Independence, Missouri in May 1846 to travel on the Oregon Trail to California. Bad weather plagued the travelers from the beginning, first with heavy rains and then snow in the mountains. In Wyoming, 87 members of the party made a fatal mistake by leaving the Oregon Trail to take what they believed would be a shortcut. By early November, the party was trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Starving, some most likely resorted to cannibalism, eating the flesh of their dead companions to survive. Just 47 of the original 87 members of the group lived to reach California. Life and death on the trails. When settlers were done traveling for the day, there were chores to be done before they could rest. They had to find water, care for their animals, set up camp, and prepare meals. They supplemented the food they brought with them with game they hunted or fish caught in streams, lakes, and rivers. Many settlers worried about the American Indians they might meet along the way, but attacks from Indians were rare. Most deaths on the trail were caused by disease, accidental gunshot wounds, or drowning. When settlers reached rivers, there were no bridges. Figuring out how to cross rivers without drowning or losing everything they owned was a constant challenge. If the settlers got sick or hurt, there were often no doctors available. Illnesses were common and often transmitted from one group of settlers to another. Many settlers became sick with pneumonia, whooping cough, measles, or smallpox. They often died before reaching their final destination. Graves of men, women, and children dotted the trails. Cholera was the deadliest disease. The infection of the intestines causes fever, chills, vomiting, and diarrhea. Settlers who came down with cholera often died within days. In the late 1840s, a severe outbreak of cholera swept through the groups of settlers. Of about the 350,000 people who set out on the Oregon Trail between 1840 and 1860, it is estimated that about 20,000 died from the disease, never seeing their new homes. For the settlers moving onto land where American Indians already lived could be a dangerous proposition. As the settlers came into their territories, the American Indians were forced by the government to move off the land to less desirable places. Conflicts were bound to happen. American Indians sometimes burned the settlers' houses, barns, and crops. They stole horses and livestock. Sometimes they killed settlers. So I'm going to pause to think about my reading. And in the section before, I noticed the details were actually describing problems. For instance, heavy wagon loads and bad weather. Now, the settlers tried to solve their problems. For instance, in the heavy wagons, they just got rid of stuff that was too heavy. But they really couldn't solve the problem of bad weather. You're really up against Mother Nature. And you really couldn't solve the problem of time, trying to get through the mountain passes at a certain time, especially if the weather continued to be such a big problem. But I also noticed there were other problems that they faced. Starvation. And although they tried to solve that problem by hunting and fishing, sometimes they couldn't solve that problem, and they had to resort to the most awful solution that I can think of, is eating your fellow travel mates after they died. Again, not the best solution, but a solution all in all. There was also another problem of drowning when they were crossing the river. I want to take you back to the text feature of this illustration and notice how they have to cross the rivers, which sometimes were very deep and the currents very strong. And those currents knocked people out of the wagon, and people didn't know how to swim, so they would drown very easily. A solution that settlers came up with was to build rafts, or take everything out of the wagon and float it across like a boat. Another problem they came up with was illness. There were no doctors, no medicines at the time. One of the greatest diseases that killed many people was cholera. It came from dirty water, and there was nothing that they could do to save the people. Although they tried different herbal remedies that they found along the way, sometimes given to them by the Native American tribes that were nice, cholera still took the lives of many people. And of course, the last problem they encountered was the Native Americans. The Native Americans were angry because their land was being taken, so sometimes they took out that anger on the European settlers. Although they tried different solutions, as we read further, you'll see of one solution that the American government tried: Army involvement. As settlers moved west, the United States Army moved along with them. The Army built a number of forts in the west, some permanent, but many others temporarily settlements that were eventually abandoned. At first, the Army's purpose in the west was to keep pace among warring American Indian tribes, and to keep white settlers from disregarding treaties and taking over Indian lands. As more settlers came west, though, clashes between Indians and settlers increased. The Army's role then became to protect settlers from Indian attacks. In the summer of 1854, Mary Perry Frost and her party faced unfriendly Indians in what is now Idaho. We had traveled perhaps an hour. Then Indians came up squarely in front of our train and stopped the teams, but appeared friendly, shaking hands and asking for whiskey. Upon being told that we had none, they began to talk of trading with the men, and while my father was talking of trading a pistol for a pony, they opened fire on us, shooting my father, my uncle, and my father's teamster. So as you can see in Chapter 2, we found some evidence to support our main ideas that we found in Chapter 1. We also discovered that the author had presented his information to us in a problem and solution format, making sure to list all the problems that the settlers faced along the way on their trails, and some possible solutions, although many of the problems were not solved and caused many people to die and a war to continue with the Native Americans. So today, try this strategy in your reading. Pause and think about how is the author presenting information to you.